If you don't know me, my name is Sarah Lauder. I'm the UGA Extension Viticulturist. I'm very excited to be here with all of y'all today, so thank you for being here. I'm excited to talk about some of the projects that I've been working on for muscadine vine spacing. But first, that's a little bit off kilter, but for the, I wanted to let you know about a grant that we just got this year. A lot of our speakers that are talking here today are a part of this grant. It's a very large scale national scope grant that is looking to expand a lot of the opportunities, a lot of the breeding opportunities between Vitis and Muscadinia. And so it has several other goals, including trying to expose more of the nation, more of the world to muscadines, and be able to evaluate a lot more muscadine production and characteristics. For my part of this, I get to be part of the evaluation of the muscadine characteristics, and so I'll be planting a couple replicated trials in the state and a demonstration trial, and then several of our other collaborators are doing that throughout the Southeast. So we should have some fun information on some of the other stuff that's getting planted. So I'm very excited about that, and there will be some cool information coming out of that over the next several years. There is also now a muscadine grape management poster. I didn't bring any of those with me today because they're very large, and it's a little bit logistically difficult to get it here and get them out. But if you're interested in this, you can talk to your extension agent who can reach out to me to see if they can potentially get one of these for any commercial production that's going on. And you can also access this via the QR code, and it's online as well. But if you want a physical poster, which can potentially be put outside, you're also welcome to do that. Just, there's a couple left that I can still pass out. So holler if you want some of that. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about today is planting density. So this is a choice that you have to make before you put everything in the ground. This is one of those early decisions that you make, but it can really affect the longevity of your vineyard, and it can affect the quality and the amount of grapes that you can get off of that. And so your goal for choosing your planting density is trying to match what your plant's growth potential is with your site potential, and so you're trying to find that mix, which there's lots of different decisions that can go into that. I'll mostly be talking about how we can determine that based on your cultivar choice. So we're largely, when you see stuff that's talking about the plant vigor, that's kind of where a lot of that will play into your choices. And then you have to evaluate your own personal site wherever you're trying to put that. So if you want to talk about that later, we can talk about that later. But this is looking at different cultivars and how some of that vigor plays in. So these vines were planted in Watkinsville. It's just outside of Athens, if you are unfamiliar with Watkinsville. But it was planted in spring of 2018 on some sandy loam soils. We have all high wire cordon trained stuff that's just at different lengths that we've given different spaces, and it's all hand pruned. I'm going to be presenting some of the data that we've collected over the last 2 years, so when those vines were 5 and 6 years old approximately. And so we looked at 6 different treatments. We had our vines either vertically divided or not vertically divided. So we either had 4 cordons or 2 cordons, and they were given either 10, 15, or 20 feet of space for that. And we looked at 2 different cultivars, Carlos and Pog. So for our Carlos, this is going to be your high vigor. If you're not familiar with Carlos, it is one of the most widely planted muscadine grapes, but it's more of a processing grape. So this is a bronze, smaller berry, planted all over the place, mid-season grape. And then we also looked at Pog, which is going to be a more medium vigor. This is one of the newer releases that have come out of the UGA Muscadine breeding program. But this is a self-fertile, very large fruited variety that I very much enjoyed being able to snack on as we've been doing this research. But this is going to be a large fruit that kind of compares to Supreme for that, but it has at least some of the notes that Dr. Patrick Connor has mentioned, that has a better picking scar, even if it doesn't hold onto the vine quite as well. But one of the other things to note is that we only had about 1 or 2 harvests per cultivar per year. So we tried to do this in as short amount of time as possible, and not necessarily something that you all are going to do for all of this. But anyway, I'm going to be going through some of the data here, but I always like to have a little spark notes. Here's some of the conclusions that I have going forward for some of this. And one, we did that vertical division where there was 2 or 4 cordons, and it's really not worth it. It was a whole lot more labor for one, and we really didn't it didn't make it worth it, especially for the labor, and it just didn't give us enough fruit to make any of that worth it. If you were trying to plant a nice fence to make it pretty right outside of a different space, fine, but generally not worth having that vertical division for just how much more work, how dense those canopies could be, and just was a lot of work. So I'm pulling off all the vines that I'm keeping. I'm taking off that second level of cordons because I don't want to prune those anymore. For Carlos, for those high vigor vines, the more vine that was given, it tended to have more fruit for that space, and it tended to be better fruit, albeit that's still a little bit inconclusive with that data. But for high vigor cultivars, having more space for those vines tends to be good. But some of those more medium vigors that, especially the ones that people have been warning about being overcropped, people have, those are going to take less space. So smaller vines gave more fruit per acre for the pulk for this. So looking at some of the data for this, here's the Carlos. This is just the yield per vine. And so we have our 10-foot over here in the blue, single and divided. I got to stand in the front of the microphone. Our 15-foot single and divided, and our 20-foot single divided. And it's all going to be in this order as I present all of these different graphs that kind of look very similar, but it'll all be in this orientation. So we saw significant differences not between the vertical division, that was not different between these treatments, but we did see a difference given the amount of space. So if it had more vine per space, then we saw more fruit from those vines, which makes sense. If you just look at the amount of fruit that came off of those cordons, so how much fruit we got off every individual foot per cordon. So we either have 10-foot, 20-foot, 15-foot, 30-foot, 20-foot, 40-foot as it goes through here. You can see that it was approximately half the fruit. So not only did it not double the amount of fruit, it essentially just kind of halved the amount of fruit that we could get off of that. So just another nail in the coffin for those divisions, that it took more work and we really did not pay off for this at all. But if you look at just the amount of space, so most of us have various particular amounts of space that we have to plant in. We really didn't see very much differences in the amount of space. There was no statistical differences for the pounds of fruit that you would get off of these vines for any of the cordons that we get. So if you have a certain amount of space that you're working with, it didn't necessarily make a difference how much fruit you got off of it. But at least, again, I mentioned that this was a little bit less conclusive for some of this data, but we potentially would get better fruit off of the 20-foot single level of cordon vines off of that. There was statistically more sugar in that 20-foot single vine, single level treatment was statistically more sugar in those. There was no other differences in the fruit quality other than for acids at least. For fruit size, did not make a difference. We didn't have much disease in this. We did spray them regularly, but you would potentially get less disease because there was more space, especially those 10-foot dual level cordons. It was also just a mess trying to get in there. So it was a struggle for just the person that was doing it, and I just can't imagine that would get a very good penetration from your sprayers as they move through there. So it was very dense for those Carlos vines. At least I did mention there was more sugar for that, and that's just 1 year of data because the 2024 data is still getting processed. So that's another reason why that's a little less conclusive. Then going over to the pulk, so we did not see statistical differences in our yield per vine for the pulk. Whether it was single, 15, 20 foot, there was a lot of variation. I didn't put the error bars on here, which I maybe should have, but there was no differences that we saw in this because there was a lot of variation that we saw for these vines for these years. So nothing here, but again, when we have per acre, we have a limited amount of space that we're working with. We did see that there was a difference between our 20-foot and our 10-foot, albeit neither of those was different from the 15-foot. So we got more fruit per acre on those pulp that were a little bit shorter for that. This was slightly easier to work with for the dual levels, but it really was not significant. Again, it's not worth it. You did not get double the fruit. You got a little bit more than half of the fruit, again, for these, for those Polk. Again, especially for the fresh market grapes, the berry size makes a big difference, but we didn't see any statistical differences. The berry size, the berry sugar, for those, all of them were about the same size as what we see, at least from the data that comes out of the Tifton program. It was about a 15-gram berry for those. And again, average sugar was also approximately the same, no differences that we found for that as well. So again, matching those vine capacities, I have blown through this a lot faster than I intended to, but matching those vine capacities with that site potential is going to lead to much better vineyard growth over time. And choosing that is always more difficult, but if you can match your vine to your site, one, not only makes a healthier vine over time, you get more fruit over time, but it also can reduce the amount of labor required within the season. If you get that match, you don't necessarily have to come through and hedge as often because it matches that balance. High vigor vines are going to need more space, but dividing that canopy does not necessarily provide that space, at least on that vertical division. It's not going to necessarily provide that space for that. So just not worth it to divide the canopy. And then our medium to low vigor vines are definitely going to be performing better with less space for that. Again, this is only 2 cultivars. This is only at one site, but this is at least some of that data that we saw consistent over the 2 years that we had from this overall. So I particularly want to thank Shane Breeden for the help that he's done with this work, and Kane Hickey, who planted those vines when he had been working in my position a couple of years ago, and the Hort Farm team in particular with Ryan and Matt, who've done a lot of help helping to get us prune everything and all of that information. And some of the undergrads who have helped process and are still processing the 2024 primary fruit chemistry for that. But with that, I will let you take any questions that you have.
You said the row space, but what was the row space?
12 foot. It's 12 foot for everything.
12 foot. Mm-hmm. So you have flat 10 or closer?
Nope. That was just the within row spacing is what we were trying. But everything was 12 foot apart.
So would your recommendation on the pulse be to plant them every 10 feet if you're only going to let 10-foot of vine?
So I would definitely plant them I would definitely not plant them at the 20. Particularly you could see some of the stress that goes in, especially those divided canopies on the 20 foot. Like those things drop leaves earlier. They did not look very happy come different times in the season. So definitely planting them with less space can give a little bit more freedom for those vines. We tried 10, 15, albeit that's largely because that's very divisible numbers. It doesn't necessarily need to be, like we didn't see differences between the 10 and the 15 foot. So you could plant it in that range and that would be fine. But that would be my recommendation, at least based on this data, is that planting it between 10 and 15 feet is better for the pulk. So it's more plants per acre, but happier, healthier vines and more fruit.
Did you see any disease pressure between the spacing?
So we didn't collect specific disease data. There wasn't a lot of disease that was present in this field, which was great for us. There was some. Even in the Carlos, albeit, like again, we didn't collect the data off of that, but I would guess that if we had, we would see slightly higher disease in those smaller vines with multiple canopies for the Carlos, if I had to guess, just based on how it looked when we were harvesting. But
I know it wasn't the purpose of this study, but I wanted to follow up. Did you notice in the field maybe any differences in pests, especially when you have them close them together?
Yeah, we didn't necessarily see too many differences in the pests, albeit this block is also right next to like 12 feet with more rows from a bunch of different bunch grapes, and there was certainly a lot of pest pressure that's hanging out over there and bird pressure that was hanging out over there. This field also had quite a bit of root borer, grape root borer that was present, albeit not obviously we didn't see any necessarily signs that there are necessarily of these testing vines that we did, but there were some border vines that we pulled up of the Muscadines that we so far didn't see any signs in the roots of grape root borer in the Muscadines, even though we know that there are some in that field. Brett Blau was the entomologist who was doing a trial on that. He was very happy with his data.
You ever see a difference in it? Did y'all try anything from north, south planting to east, west planting?
So this is all, all planted in the same direction. And so I'm pretty sure that's north-south, albeit now I'm forgetting where my farm is running. But we didn't test any differences on the orientation.
So you mentioned, the 10 foot, you get more yield per acre, but several times you've talked about the labor costs and getting in there and getting the berries out.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know with that cross section of diminished return on labor is based on this 10 foot, 15 foot, 20 foot?
So I wouldn't necessarily imagine that there's a huge labor. It is definitely harder for the Carlos on that higher density, and there's definitely a labor component for having the divided canopy. And I would definitely say that the divided canopy does not provide that return for sure, which I should have been repeating these questions now that I just heard my voice echo in this microphone. This is talking about the cost of different vine spacing on here. For the Polk especially, those smaller vines was not necessarily harder to pick. It was slightly larger vines within that space, but those were not as dense as those high vigor vines. So other than planting pressure, I wouldn't consider there being as much of a labor differential for this. Any other questions? Perfect. Anyway, I'll be hanging out. So if you have more questions as we go through here, but I now have the pleasure to introduce our next speaker. So now we have Anne-Marie Cahagan, who is going to be talking about Grape Expectations, evaluating texture and shelf life in Muscadine varieties. Take it away.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here for this session. My name is Anne-Marie, and I'm a master's student at the University of Georgia, studying plant breeding, genetics, and genomics. So I'm going to be talking about some research that I've been conducting about evaluating texture and shelf life in Muscadine varieties. So to begin, I want everyone to just think about biting into a nice, juicy grape. Now, a lot of you may be picturing Muscadines, but for the common consumer, they're likely thinking about a vinifera grape. And that is because there are different expectations that consumers have whenever thinking about a grape in general. They may be thinking of the taste, but they're also thinking about the textures whenever they put them into their mouths. For the grocer, they have different expectations. These are primarily related to how fresh the produce seems, that they can later sell it and get a return on their investment. So obviously, I don't have any Muscadines pictured here, and that's because, like I said, most of these expectations are based off of the vinifera grapes or the table grapes rather than Muscadines. In reality, we know that Muscadines are very different from table grapes, and while you and I may know and love them for their very interesting and unique flavor, their large size, and for the fact that they are locally grown and a native crop, people elsewhere in the United States might not recognize this as the traditional grape. But Muscadines do have a lot of potential. So within our breeding program, we're wanting to select for some of those loved texture characteristics of the table grape. That way we can make our Muscadines slightly more able to mimic what the common consumer and grocer is expecting whenever they think of a grape. So how can we make this happen? Two things that we're looking for in our breeding program are a firmer berry as well as a thinner skin. And these are parts of the expectations that both the consumer and the grocer have for grapes. So as we're selecting for these attributes within our breeding program, we were concerned about what else might be affected. Specifically, we were worried about how these attributes may affect the storageability of Muscadine. So for example, breeding for thinner skins, we were worried that perhaps this would increase transpiration and then cause the grapes to lessen their shelf life. Obviously, if we're having the purpose of bringing this to a wider audience by making the expectations mimic what people are used to, we also want to be able to transport them out of the area where they're commonly found. So storageability would be even more important when thinking about the transportation of muscadine as well. So the purpose of this study was really just to examine a variety of berry attributes related to texture and then take that a step further to investigate their effect on storage. So this is a storage study. We were able to store these grapes at a low temperature and high humidity, and then recorded data at 3 different time points, including the day of harvest, and then again after 2 weeks, and again after 4 weeks. So this was a very exploratory study. Basically, if there was a way to measurement, we tried to get some data on that. But I would like to talk about some of the really big important metrics that we studied. So the first attribute I want to discuss is firmness. We used this machine to measure the firmness, and you can think of this as the way that a berry feels whenever you squeeze it between your fingers. Now, this is obviously very important because for both the consumer and the grocer, firmness is a representation of the first impression that a muscadine is going to make. Obviously, if you're thinking about buying some fruit, the first thing you're going to do is pick it up, and you can immediately tell how firm it is in between your fingers. So just to walk you through how this measurement is taken, this machine has a little probe, and it's going to push down on the top of the grape. And through this, it's going to record the force and distance, and from that, extrapolate a line. There's also a minimum and maximum force threshold that the machine is recording, and from this, it can use the slope of the line in between those thresholds to calculate firmness. And then I do have a video that way y'all can kind of visualize how this machine works. It is pretty quick. It just goes through, taps the berry, and reaches those force thresholds, and then is able to calculate firmness. All right, so the next measurement that I want to talk about is puncture work. You can think about puncture work as the way that a berry would feel whenever you're biting through the skin with your teeth. So we use a different machine for this, and we just put the berry on a little stage to hold it still while taking the measurement, and then it has a probe that comes down and actually punctures through the skin of the berry straight into the flesh, just like you would with your teeth. Once again, I do have videos. One is of a muscadine and the other a table grape. Whenever we're looking at this first video of the muscadine here, I want you to notice how the skin kind of divots in as that probe is coming down before it's able to finally puncture through the berry. Now, whenever we watch this video with the table grape, you can see that it is a lot more quick to puncture through the berry, so that can kind of give you a perception of how a softer fruit looks for this measurement versus a firmer fruit. So the next important measurement is skin thickness. Like I said, this is something that we're actively breeding for within our program. So for this, we use the same machinery as for puncture work, and we just sliced off a thin piece of skin. That way it could lay flat on the stage like this, and then the same probe would come down and measure the distance from first making contact with the skin until it's able to push all the way through to the plate. All right, so like I said, this was a very exploratory study, so this is just a fraction of what we were measuring, but I would like to talk about some of the results that we learned from these important measurements. The first thing that I'll look at is the change in firmness over time. So I'm going to kind of build this up for y'all. We're going to look at firmness, and I'm going to show the firmness for each of our genotypes over the storage period. So you can see how this measurement looks at week 0, week 2, and week 4. So as you can see, first off the bat, there is a lot of variation within our germplasm for how firmness looks. Just to give y'all a bit of an example, if you know how Supreme, Fry, or Delicious feels and how firm it is, that can give you an example of what else we have in our germplasm. What I think was really important from what we learned about firmness is that if berries were firm to begin with, they remained firm at the end as well. So though within each genotype you can see firmness at week 0 is higher than firmness at week 4, the ones that were firmest at week 0 are still generally firmest at week 4. So this means that firmness at the day of harvest is a good indicator of how well that texture will hold up throughout the storage period. Now, to look at this same graph in terms of puncture work, we see a lot of the same trends. Again, we have those examples if you know about Supreme, Delicious, or Fry. So same thing, of course, there is going to be a diminish in puncture work over time, but if it was a strong puncture work to begin with, it's going to be strong at the end of the storage period as well. All right, next I'd like to introduce a new metric that we use called percent marketability. So at each time point in storage, we could remove the berries, and if there were any signs of rotting or the berry was shriveled, basically if it didn't look too delicious anymore, we would take that out and count that and use it to calculate what percent of the berries were still marketable or still looked good. Now, as you can imagine, over time, berries are starting to reach the end of their shelf life, and you can tell that as time in storage goes on, percent marketability also decreases as berries are no longer viable. I think this is a good comparison whenever we think about the loss of firmness and the loss of puncture work over time. It's not necessarily that something that we bred for is causing the berries to reach the end of their life. That's just something that's naturally happening over the storage period. But, of course, we are really looking for is how this percent marketability affects the things that we're actively breeding for. So using percent marketability as a metric for the ability of the berry to store over time, we can look at this in comparison to skin thickness, which we are actively breeding for, and we see that there is no correlation between these two, and that's really reassuring that as we continue to breed for thinner skins, it's not affecting the percent marketability or the berry's ability to store over time. And looking at the same comparison between percent marketability and now firmness, once again, there was no significant correlation between these two metrics, thus reassuring us that as we breed for firmness, it's not going to affect the berry's ability to store over time. All right, so just to wrap some things up and go over what we've talked about today, first off, I'd like to discuss that consumers and grocers have expectations for grape textures. And primarily, these are based off of the expectations of table grapes rather than muscadine. But firm berries with thin skins are desired, and those are things that we're actively breeding for in our program to make the textures of muscadine a little bit more palatable to consumers and grocers who may not be familiar with muscadines themselves. We also learned that firmness diminishes over a storage period relative to initial firmness. So once again, that's whenever I was talking about how the firmest berries at the start of storage are still going to be the firmest at the end of storage, even though firmness within each genotype does diminish. And this allows us to use firmness on harvest as an indicator for how firm the berry will be after the storage period. And finally, our breeding efforts on texture have little impact on storageability. This is great for us because we can continue to breed the way that we have been, selecting for firmer berries and thinner skins, and know that it's not going to cause the berries to have a shorter shelf life in terms of storage. And as we continue this study throughout this year as well, we're going to be looking at maybe some different storage conditions and maybe alter the storage period just to get more information about just how much texture is related to storageability. And with that, I would like to thank the Institute of Plant Breeding, Genetics and Genomics, as well as Dr. Patrick Connor, the principal investigator for this project, and our lab technician, Guna, who was a huge help in harvest and getting things ready for my samples. All right, thank you. Are there any questions today? Yes, sir.
Thank you much for the thickness of the skin within the rose selection.
Yes, that's a good question. Yes, so the question was asking about how skin thickness or the things that we're breeding for might affect rotting in the field versus during storage. I do think we noticed some more insects on varieties with thinner skins, but we don't have any conclusive data on that, so it's still a work in progress. Yes. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you so much.
All right. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Angelos Delsidis from UGA, based at the Tifton campus. So take it away, talking about innovative technologies for prolonging the shelf life of Georgia muscadines.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm going to talk to you about some technologies that exist out there to extend the shelf life, but I will also show you what has been done in the literature. I'm not going to spend too much time into that. You all know this better than I do. You're very specialists in muscadines. We need to keep in mind that muscadines are a different type of grapes compared to bunch grapes. They are harvested singly or in clusters rather than in bunches. They have a slipped skin and they're seeded. Also, the fruit is growing on top of trellises rather than hanging as they do in the bunch grapes. And when we talk about soluble solids or Brix levels, we are in the range between 13 and 24. Have a wide range right there. Brachis is less of a problem with muscadines, but the stem scar is an issue that I see very often. We have, let's say, an area where we can have injury. When they're pulled from the vine, you have juices leaking out and decay often growing in that spot. During storage, the main problem we see is softening. They end up not being very firm if they're stored for too long. And so we have only a few weeks of shelf life, maybe 5 if we're lucky, whereas you can have months of storage for the bunch grapes. Some quality attributes and quality characteristics for muscadine grapes. High quality muscadines should be free of injury, decay, or any sun scald. They should appear and feel turgid, have a dry stem scar, that's very important, and should be fully colored, black or bronzed, depending on the cultivar. The maturity indices, how to decide when to harvest. You need to make sure that you don't have to pull very hard. You should be able to detach the fruit by gently pulling. And in general, the minimum soluble solids should be between 14 and 18%. There's no standard packaging when it comes to muscadines. There's a variety of different packaging. Quart size is commonly used. And generally, fruit are packed as single or small clusters of berries in these clamshells. I'm going to talk more about the fresh market muscadines as a higher value and more and very important for our industry. We need to make sure that we choose an appropriate cultivar that has large, firm, and crisp berries with thin peel if possible. And again, the stem scar should remain should dry quickly and should be small if possible. Cooling and refrigeration are very, very important, as that's the only way we have to reduce all the metabolic activities and to extend shelf life. When you're looking into a fresh market, labor is a big issue. Since we are 100% hand harvesting berries for fresh market, you need to make sure you have the adequate labor to do the work. Packaging and labels are also important. You need to think about it beforehand, and the dimensions and size are dictated by the market source. Also, if you were to ship or if you were to sell in the farm, that's something you have to keep in mind. How are you going to keep cold and free of bruising all the berries you're harvesting? For example, harvesting and throwing your berries like that is not ideal because you're going to have a lot of bruising in these berries. Packaging, as I mentioned, there's many different types of packaging, from bulk in boxes that are shipped to bags, clamshells from 1 pound all the way to a quart, as well as individual bags. A lot of breeding is being done both at UGA and in other institutions, and they're working. Our colleagues are working to improve the fruit size, to create a more dry stem scar, create firmer berries with a thinner peel, and in general make later varieties to extend the season. Some common fresh market varieties that you're probably familiar with. You have 3 major types: bronze, purple, and red. Red are not as common. You see pictures of how they look, and some are very popular here in Georgia, and you see them in the market very often. There are seedless muscadines that have been bred in the recent years. They're a hybrid with the vinifera grape. They're smaller, they mature more uniformly, and they have sweet and crunchy. And the two ones that I have come across with are the Omai and the Razzmatazz, and they're out there in the stores. On the right here, you can see some work that was done a few years ago in North Carolina, where it shows the firmness resistant to puncture in newtons of a number of varieties. In this case here, Supreme was the firmest one, and then Terra was the softest one. Moving on to quality defects, it's very important to make sure that when you pack the fruit, you end up discarding all the muscadines with quality defects. Some of these that are available in the USDA website, discoloration in the surface, stem scar. When you pull the stem, you often have this open wound, as well as spotted berries, as you see on the right. Some other very typical ones, shriveling, as I said, when fruit lose water because of low relative humidity in the cold room, they end up shriveling. And that is a visual issue, but also they tend to become softer. Leaky berries are a problem, especially if they're cracked. You have decay growing in the stem and scar. That's a big problem. And you have splits and browning that appear after a long-term storage. When we harvest for fresh market, as I said, hand harvest is the only option we have to avoid injury and bruising. If possible, it's good to harvest directly into the final container, like the clamshell or the bag, to avoid extra handling, but I know this is not always the case. It's not always possible. One suggestion that is valid for most fruits and vegetables, picking fruit early after the dew has dried out is good to reduce field heat. Because when you bring fruit in the middle of the day that is 90, 95 degrees or 85 degrees, you need to cool it down from that temperature to the optimum one, which is like less than 40 degrees. So you need to spend much more time, much more energy to cool it down, and this is negative for the quality of the fruit. Cooling quickly after harvest is important to reduce heat load and softening. Overall, the good news is that ethylene is not an issue with muscadine grapes. It does not, they don't produce much ethylene. However, harvesting early and waiting for them to become sweeter is not going to work. So don't harvest early trying to think, oh, in a few days they're going to change a little bit color. They do not do that after harvest. So, as I mentioned before, temperature management is very important, ideally below 40 degrees. I know that this should read 32 to 34, not 24. Sorry about that. 32 to 34 should be the target. It's hard to get there, we know, but you want to get lower than 40 if possible. High relative humidity of 90 to 95% is also crucial to avoid dehydration of the berry. And cooling within 12 hours of harvest with forced air cooling is ideal. Washing could be beneficial but also detrimental depending on how well it's done and if the fruit dry afterwards. Some people do chlorine washes, 100 ppm chlorine immediately before transportation to maintain quality and control fungal pathogens, but if the fruit doesn't dry well, you might end up having issues with wet fruit during transportation. Cold storage, again, as I mentioned, forced air cooling is the best way to cool your fruit quickly. In case you don't know what forced air cooling is it's a high pressure system where you have fans that pull air through the product and they remove heat quickly. So instead of having the fruit sitting warm for a day or longer, it'll take you a couple of hours or even less to cool down the fruit. Room cooling after that, after you achieve the temperature, is ideal to reduce mold and shrivel. Higher temperatures, higher than the ideal one, will definitely shorten the shelf life. It's been shown in some work that was done in North Carolina a few years ago that you can do 20 days at 33 degrees, and that could be equal to 4 days at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. So something you want to work on is to plan in advance of the harvest to make sure you have the refrigeration capacity for your product. As I mentioned, there's a lot of breeding that is underway with new cultivars, with dry stem scar. The shelf life could be up to 3 weeks or even longer. 4 and 5 weeks I've seen lately are common. Sulfur dioxide that is being used for table grades is still not an option due to the bleaching of the peel for muscadines. Whereas MA, modified atmosphere with 10 to 15% CO2 plus 5 to 10% oxygen might work, but there is a question of chilling injury at the very low temperatures. Some more about sanitation and food safety in the farm and the packing house. You want to make sure you follow all the protocols for field sanitation, especially if you're using manure and if you have animals around the field. You want to use clean boxes or lugs and sanitize them frequently. You want to have a clean packing shed, and in general, you need sanitary facilities with running water for pickers. I'm going to switch gear and show you a small trial we did a couple of years ago where we looked into some other methods to extend the shelf life of muscadine grapes in Georgia. To do that, we used 2 cultivars, Supreme, which is a dark purple coloration cultivar, and PAM, which is a bronze yellow coloration cultivar, both patented by Isons. We wanted to do that to look at alternative storage regimes to extend the shelf life past 2 to 3 weeks, which is the standard so far. So we used 2 different technologies on top of cold storage, of course, controlled atmosphere storage and ozone treatments. And we evaluated the efficacy of those technologies in the suppression of disease incidence and in the overall quality of the fruit. As I mentioned, we had 2 cultivars, and the treatments were 40 degrees Fahrenheit with 90% relative humidity, and then cold storage plus CA of 5% oxygen and 15% CO2, and cold storage plus 0.5 parts per million gaseous ozone. The gaseous ozone was maintained with a generator and a timer, and it was kept at 0.5 ppm. And we had a nitrogen flushing system to maintain the CA storage conditions. Our berries were stored for up to 35 days, and measurements were taken every 7 days. So we had weekly measurements. We had in total 6 measurement days, 0, 7, 14, 21, 28, 35. And we had clamshells of 25 berries and 3 reps per condition. We looked at weight, visual appearance, firmness, color, and respiration rates. And we took pictures, and I will show you some of the data. When it comes to firmness, overall, we didn't see many changes across time. After 35 days of storage, which is 5 weeks, we saw that control was a little firmer, and controlled atmosphere was a little softer, and there was no difference. The ozone was right in between. For the rest of the storage times, there was no difference whatsoever. That was for PAM. For Supreme, there was a decline over time in firmness, as you would expect, but there was no clear pattern in what we saw. Respiration rates were we had a more clear result. We had higher respiration rates with controlled atmosphere storage, followed by ozone, and control air had the lowest one. pretty much for both cultivars. It shows that CA and ozone stressed the fruit. So we believe that the CO2 level in our case was probably a little too high. We had 15%, and that was causing damage in the fruit, but it was not visible even after 35 days of storage. So the quality looked good, but we believe that we shouldn't go that high with CO2. The color is advancing on its own. The color data were mixed. There was no clear pattern throughout the storage period, and that's both for A, B values as well as for the hue. Hue declined over time for PAM, which is expected, but there was a lot of variability in between. So here you see visual quality after 35 days of storage. It's kind of dark. You can see very well here. There is no significant shriveling issues, no decay incidents in any of the fruit, which was surprising. We're expecting to see some decay after 35 days, but we didn't see that. So overall, with this small trial we did, as I said, a couple of years ago, we saw firm fruit even after 35 days of storage. We saw an increase in respiration over time, and controlled atmosphere showed the highest rates. Ozone did produce lower B color values. Control showed lower A values in Supreme. And in general, the most interesting thing is that there was no decay incidence. We had only very small amounts of burn and shriveling in the later days of storage. So maybe what we should do is we should probably push it a little longer to see if we can see see some decay and reduce the CO2 levels. But that would be done in the future work. So wrapping this up, I'd like to have this take-home message for you all. When you are planning to grow muscadines and when you're thinking of what you should do, you need to determine the market before you start and select varieties based on the choices of the market. It's good to line up the possible market outlets and backups before the harvest starts, and you want to see the needs for harvesting, for labor, and for mechanized harvesting if it's possible. In general, there are grading standards out there. The USDA has some, and I have the links in the following slides. And you need to train your workers. And ideally, you want to keep your fresh market fruit near 33 to 35 degrees for a long shelf life. With that, these are some resources. I will share the presentation, and you'll be able to find it online probably. IFAS has a very good extension publication out, as does NC State, and we're hoping to put one as UGA very soon. And with that, I would like to thank my team at the Vidali Onion Lab, Dr. Pat Connor, for helping with sourcing berries, as well as Pock Vineyards and Isons for providing much of this work. Ramsey Korn did a lot of the second part of the study that was hands-on activity, and Penny Perkins-Vesey did some of the preliminary work and provided information for this PowerPoint. With that, I don't know if we have any time. We're about 20 minutes in. We have time. I'll be happy to take any questions. I didn't know I had a...
Did you get any chill injury when you get close to 32?
I haven't...
Sometimes I hear about people getting chill injury, other times not. I don't have a good feel for why you see it sometimes.
I haven't seen any chilling injury. And in that case, we had 40 degrees, so it was way above. But I've gone down to 33, and I haven't seen it. So maybe it's variety dependent. I don't know. But I haven't seen it in the 2-3 varieties I worked with. I haven't seen chilling injury. Yeah, and to me the most surprising was that 35 days at 40, to me, I would expect after 3 weeks they would just be done, but they weren't. So either we were really careful and we had very good conditions, simulate the actual market situation, which is an issue usually when we do things in the lab, or I don't know, we were lucky that year. It didn't rain a lot, because we didn't have any fungal growth, any mold. Any other questions or comments?
Sometimes it depends on the storage room. So if you have a hot spot and then the air circulation is not really good, then there might be a chilling spot within the storage.
Mm-hmm.
So something to think about it. Depends on the airflow, where it's landed.
Yeah.
Or there's a couple of spots. So it's better to put a sensor within the room so that you know the temperature range.
Yeah, in Nabucco, you have a very good point. If you go close to the compressor, you might end up, having much lower temperatures. So, you want to make sure you don't put your fruit close to that location. Any other questions or comments? Thank you, guys.
As you see in this small pack, there is two pieces of muscadine. One is white and one is purple, okay? So I want to ask you at the end to see which one do you like. So this is a fresh fruit, just freeze-dried directly without no sugar. So the sweetness is from the fruit. Okay, I want to talk about a story of the freeze-dried muscadine. So muscadine in Florida has been grown for many, many years. So there are about 1,500 acres of muscadine in Florida, mainly for juice and wine production, and just Carlos and Nobel, about 90-95% of those are for juice and wine. So we have been working with the breeder in the Southeast, especially Dr. Patrick Connor in the UGA, to evaluate some fresh market muscadine to see if we can develop help grower, they can grow muscadine for fresh market in Florida without any overlap with the grower in the UGA, in Georgia, and North Carolina. So, as I said, there are many cultivar available, many variety available in the Southeast. UGA has a really good website and resource. They divide this cultivar to two groups, cultivar or variety for juice and wine, and cultivar for fresh market is a really good resource if you need information to find which one is good for production in your area. I think that's a really good resource you can visit, UGA grape breeding website. So as I said, I have been working with Dr. Patrick Connor to evaluate some of his selection in Georgia and see how we can develop the fresh market muscadine growing in Florida. We planted about 12 selection, I think, a few years ago, or 8 selection, 12 probably, Patrick. 8 to 12 selection about 4 or 5 years ago. And we include in that plot Polk, Supreme, Hall, Granuval, to do the evaluation between this selection and those like a common cultivar, already available cultivar, to see which one has the earliness for us very important. We would like to have something that become early. We can sell them early, harvest them in July, 3rd week of July or 4th week of July or earlier than that. That is a really good thing for us. So we have been looking for that. So as a result of that, I have harvesting the fruit of the muscadine and take it to different local market or farmer market around Florida state, and ask people to see which one they like or which one they dislike. So I have an objective to take this selection to the farmer market and ask which one do you like, which one dislike, and then I found out that over 60% actually in the Southeast in those markets they never heard about muscadine. So I was surprised that a big number, 60%, it seemed there is a lot of work about this crop to be known, and 60% they didn't know about muscadine, I mean, those market, and you imagine in the US probably that would be around 80-90% if you go to a little bit Midwest and the West. So anyway, so during those farmer market work, and also we did a lot of evaluation and test panel at university as an extension event, field day, to see which one they like, which one they dislike, to have a process for the introducing a cultivar or selection to cultivar, or see how people reaction to different or new selection. So during those evaluations, so we found two issues that people don't like about the Muscadine: a thick skin and the seed. So, and I should say some people really say we don't like Muscadine. About 40–50% they said we don't like Muscadine. So this, in those markets, we found out and the rest, they said the issue is a thick skin and the seed. So that was the issue. We designed the experiment to see when, because most of the people, when they eat the Muscadine, they actually threw out the skin, okay? So we developed an experiment to see what they miss or what they lost when they threw the skin. So as you know, there is no difference between Muscadine in regard of flesh, regardless of the color. The flesh all the same. So they are like all the pigment or anthocyanin are in the peel. So we developed an experiment to evaluate what people miss when they threw out the peel. So as you can see, so here is the total anthocyanin. So we just measure the bioactive component that are health beneficial property, such as anthocyanin, phenolic component, antioxidant, or antioxidant capacity, total phenolic component. So we measure just those, but there are a lot of mineral and vitamin that we did not measure it here. So as you can see here, we have the peel and flesh, and in terms of anthocyanin, in this purple skin selection or cultivar, the anthocyanin is around 40 times more than in the flesh. So again here, lactic acid and total phenolic component, as you can see in the peel, the red bar, and the blue on the flash. So about 400, 500 more. In the peel, you have the phenolic component, and here about lactic acid. So all of these components are health beneficial. There are many studies available for this component. They are anti-cancer, they call them. A lot of studies regardless of bioactive component. Here again, you can see in the total antioxidant capacity, again, peel, flesh. You can see in the peel almost around 600, 1,000 more antioxidant activity you can see in the peel in comparison to the flesh. So we decide to see what we can do that people can eat the peel. You know, this is a really high value fruit in terms of anthocyanin, those bioactive components. So we decide to do some dehydration and drying. So drying and dehydration they are the very traditional old methodology, has been used for many fruit crops to dry fruit in sun or sulfuric acid in different places and in different countries, different fruit. So we decide to do some dehydration, with dehydrator, and we ended up with sort of if you imagine a raisin with no flesh, so like a laddery is probably worse than the fresh muscadine. So the fresh peel. So then we purchased a freeze dry for our lab and said, let's do the freeze dry. And this is the freeze dry muscadine, and this is the dehydrated muscadine. The good thing about the freeze dry muscadine is, as you tested, it was crunchy or not. So, the skin is crunchy. You do not feel that laddery in terms of dehydration and also in terms of freshness. So we purchased a small freeze dry from Harvest Right company in Utah, and then cut this muscadine in half, remove the seed by hand in the lab, and freeze dry them. For this machine that we have, we could freeze dry them for 27 hours. That's the process that we done. I should say before the freeze drying, we put actually the muscadine berry in the freezer, minus 20 Celsius, 30 Celsius. So that actually helped to the freeze dry to use less energy if you use the freeze muscadine rather than the fresh product. So again, a little bit the process, the shape and the skin, everything looks really nice, came out very nice. So then we decide to do the experiment, and all is published. We decide to do experiment. If we freeze dry the muscadine, what we will miss, or everything will be the same. So we study Noble, Supreme, Polk as a purple peel cultivar, and then Carlos, Granivol, and Triumph as a bronze color. And you can see here like a whole berry. Here is sort of a half berry peel, and the flesh and the freeze dry. That is the difference. So the food bioprocess technology, we published this paper, is available online. So then we measure those bioactive components to see if during the freeze dry we missed or we lost any of these bioactive components. And as you can see, the red one, frozen, considered fresh because we harvest them fresh, put them in minus 30, and then freeze dry. So frozen, that means the fresh muscadine. And then freeze dry, those frozen, that went to we put them in the freeze dryer. So you see no differences in terms of missing or loss of those, the anthocyanin during this process. The same thing here for the phenolic content. As you can see, no differences. Freeze dry did not affect of those components. And here, total antioxidant activity, as you can see, there is no difference. But I should say there is difference between the cultivar, and that's normal. You see there is difference between cultivar. So generally, the bronze cultivar has less phenolic component or anthocyanin. So you can see difference between the bronze and the purple. But in terms of difference between freeze dry and then the fresh, there is no differences. So freeze dry, this was the sort of a small study that we did at University of Florida in 2023. So a lot of growers in the southeast, North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, they are a small grower, muscadine grower, I mean. So freeze dry is an opportunity for them that they can actually harvest their berry, freeze them, and then slowly freeze dry and send them to them, have it on their shelf through the like a farmer market. I think it can be available all around the year. That's a really good thing. So one thing that we did not measure in this study, a mineral and vitamin. So freeze dry might affect on those components we don't know. There are some studies done in some other fruit crop, some grain like soybean, we've seen that the freeze dry can affect the oil quality and some mineral, but in fruit, there is no study, or at least I haven't seen that freeze dry can affect vitamin or mineral. That would be a good thing, and we will probably do that as well. And the energy, freeze dry need a lot of energy. So 27 hours at least we need for this small machine to freeze dry about 4 or 5 pounds of muscadine. So that is costly, and that's also issue. But there is a lot of opportunity. Specifically when we freeze dry this muscadine, we took the sample to those people who actually dislike the fresh one to see how they like it. And most of them, all of them actually, they said, we like the freeze dry. So I see there is an opportunity for this product. Now I would like that people from industry take this to the next level, and hopefully we see it on the supermarket shelf in the future. So there are some seedless muscadine available through the Jeff breeding program. So hopefully those one in the future also consider for the freeze dry, and probably could be easier because removing seed can be costly manually for sure. And we have been working, we have some idea that we can remove the seed as well. We have been working with mechanical engineer to see if we can come with some idea, and we have some idea about it. So that's it about the freeze-dry muscadine. All the process, like in the easy language, available in this Edis publication, freeze-dry muscadine grape, and all studies scientifically with difference between freeze-dry and different between the cultivar for peel are available in this journal, Food Bioprocess Technology and Journal of Food Measurement and Characterization. I want to thank Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services for providing fund, NIFA USDA, and University of Georgia Grape Breeding Program, and my team that we have been working in muscadine, and sometimes we're harvesting this big muscadine, as you can see. So they are nectarine, okay. I'll put it here. Okay, that's it. If you have any question, I'm happy to answer. Yes, please.
Do you have an idea on the shelf life after they're freeze-dried like that?
So as long as you can vacuum it, you can keep it for, I think, we have them in our lab for now. We are studying 23 and we still no problem. But I tell you, depend of the component. For example, we freeze dry many fruit crops to see which one it's good. For example, persimmon or kaki. So the pigment in persimmon is carotenoid, so it's like an orange color. When we freeze dry in 2023, so I haven't done a research on it, but I see that those your orange color become pale and white. So I assume it can affect, but on muscadine, I haven't seen that visually. But I think that's a good question to do sort of a maybe year or 2 year period to see what you lost in terms of the bioactive component. As long as you vacuum it, you can keep the crunchiness, and I can say, and no change in the color. Yes, please.
The smaller machine that you purchased, how expensive is it?
The one that we purchased, $3,000. But they are machine that, that's the smallest one, and they are commercial machine can cost $200,000, $300,000. They're like big machine. Yes, please.
How long did you keep them in the freezer before you put them in the freezer?
So as you know, the muscadine, for example, is like a three weeks window, depending on which cultivar you have. We have 3-4 freezer, bench freezer, we fill it with muscadine, and we harvest freeze dry during the year.
Okay.
So I can say probably at least 3 days. We have been busy with harvesting. We harvest and freeze them, and then the 3 days at least, and then a year, and also we freeze dry after 1 year. Yes, please.
So you slice the pick after freezing them, right? Like you slice them in half and pick the seeds after freezing.
Yes, freeze them and then cut them, remove the seed, and put them in the. Yes.
Two comments addressing how long you can store them. There are oxygen absorbers and desiccants that you can put in.
That's right.
That will extend the life. If you believe the literature, 20 years.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And we have been using those oxygen absorbers in the bigger bag. Yeah.
Right. We've done this with blueberries. And
Yeah.
we found the marketing is wonderful with the clear front plastic, but they don't hold up as well as the nylon on both sides. So they'll last a lot longer than nylon.
Mm-hmm.
Both sides. But yeah, they'll go quite well.
Very good. Thank you. So which one did you like, the purple one or the white one?
I haven't tasted either one. I'm looking at my wife.
No, I mean everyone. Okay.
Yeah. So what varieties were those?
The purple one is Supreme, and the yellow one I think is Hard. So we did differently.
Thank you so much. Thanks for sharing. All right. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Patrick Connor, who's going to be updating us on his breeding program for muscadines.
All right, thanks, Sarah. All right, everybody, thanks for hanging in to this last talk. I'm going to be talking about some work we're doing in the breeding program to expand the genetic base of Muscadine and try and get more variability into it, and hopefully with that variability get some more vigor into the breeding program. Well, just a quick little bit about Muscadine and grapes and where they fall. The grape genera is the Vitis genera, and within that genera there's two subgenus, Muscadinia, which have 40 chromosomes, and there's just 3 species in the New World in that subgenera. Vitis rotundifolia, which is our common muscadine. Most of what we're eating and working with is Vitis rotundifolia. There's a second species, although some people call it a variety instead of a species, Vitis monsoniana, and that's found anywhere from South Georgia down through Florida. Very similar to rotundifolia, except the berries are much smaller, tend to have a thinner skin and more berries per cluster. And then in southern Mexico, Central America is Vitis popenoii, which is a third species. I've seen only one accession of that, although I think it is fairly common in its home area. And then in the subgenera Vitis, they all have 38 chromosomes. In there you have most of your bunch grapes that you know, your Vitis vinifera, which are all your store-bought grapes that you eat, as well as your wine grapes. Vitis labrusca, which would be Concord-type grapes. And there's over 60 other species, both within North America as well as in Europe and Asia. And so all the breeders in this subgenera have a lot to work with because they can breed with all those species and get all that variability into their breeding programs. But because we have 40 chromosomes in muscadines and 38 in the bunch grapes, when you cross the two, you get 39 chromosomes, and that makes generally those hybrids sterile. And so it's kind of like horses and donkeys. You can cross the two and get mules, but you can't go any further than that because of the sterility. And so what that's meant for practical aspect for breeders is you have us few muscadine breeders in Southeast U.S. Usually there's only, 2 to 4 of us at any given time. And we're kind of doing our thing, and then you have all the breeders of the bunch grapes in North America as well as in Europe and Asia and other places. And they're doing their things. And there's really not much cross work between the two because of the difficulty of making those crosses and getting fertility. And there's some exceptions to that, and we'll talk about that in the end. But what it's meant for our breeding program is we're really down to working with these 3 species. And so if we're trying to bring in variability into the breeding program, we're going to have to be using those 3 species. So we didn't think much about inbreeding depression in the breeding program until a cooperative project with Eric Staffney and his graduate student Haley, where they were just looking at the pedigrees of a bunch of muscadines and calculating inbreeding coefficient. An inbreeding coefficient is the likelihood that you're getting 2 alleles in an individual identical by descent from a common ancestor. And so if you were to have 2 unrelated parents crossed and produce siblings, and then you cross those 2 siblings, your inbreeding coefficient would be 0.25. And so you can see when we looked at those, the older releases like Fry had very low inbreeding coefficient of 0.005. Summit and Triumph that were released in 1977 is a little higher, 0.135. But then we looked at the more modern releases, Palk, Ruby Chris, Lane, Majesty. Those all had inbreeding coefficients of 0.303. And then some of the other ones like Hall were even higher at 0.332. And so when you consider that the full sib mating is 0.25, these coefficients are higher than that, which means that these are getting fairly inbred, especially for a species which in nature has male and female plants in the wild. And so they're not allowed or able to cross themselves in the wild. That produces more genetic variability. And so if we're crossing things and getting this high of an inbreeding coefficient, we might be seeing problems with our progenies in that we're getting too inbred, which oftentimes leads to lack of vigor. So once we saw that, we decided to go out in the field and see what Well, let me cover this first. We're going to see how much lack of vigor we were seeing in our actual progenies. Just as an example of where this inbreeding depression is coming from, look at the progeny or the pedigree of Ruby Crisp, which was our most recent release. And if you look at it, so you have parents, Supreme and Terra. Your grandparents are Black Fry, Dixieland, Summit, and Triumph. That seems fine. You know, those are all different names. Doesn't look like inbreeding. But when you go back to the great-grandparents, then you start to see where the inbreeding is coming from. In that you have Triumph, Summit, and Dixieland are all the same cross. They're all sister seedlings of each other. It's all Fry by Georgia 2949. And then you go up to Black Fry, and it's Fry, which is in these pedigrees, and Coward. And so that's quite a bit of Fry and 2949 coming through. That's leading to those high inbreeding coefficients because you can be inheriting the same alleles through multiple areas in the pedigree. So what does it look like in the field when you get high inbreeding? This is Georgia 1913, so that's a particular cross. And it has an inbreeding coefficient of 0.29, so that's higher than that 0.25 of a sister seedling crossing to each other. This is what we commonly were seeing in the field. These are all different seedlings of that cross planted 2 feet apart down the row. You can see there's a lot of skips. Those skips, we plant every 2 feet, but if you're seeing skips, that means those seedlings died at some point. These are probably 3-year-old vines here. You can see they made it up to the wire, and they got some canes growing down, but they're kind of yellowish. There's not a lot of vigor on them. You're seeing a little bit of fruit, but they just look relatively unhealthy. We compare that to a different cross, Georgia 1904, which has a very low inbreeding coefficient of 0.05. And so the one progeny was here, this one's right next to it, planted at the same time. You can see this family, very vigorous, not many skips. The canes are growing down to the ground. There's just a lot of vigor there. When we looked at a large number of progenies and we measured trunk diameter as a measure of vigor, we saw a good correlation between as your inbreeding coefficient went higher, your cane or your trunk diameter went lower, showing that over a large number of progenies, if you have higher inbreeding, you have lower vigor. So what is that a problem in a breeding program? Well, this is what you're getting when you release lower vigor things. We've seen it a lot in some of our more recent selections. One of the things we've done, Muscadine vines in nature are male or female vines, but through early breeding work, we made self-fertile vines. Self-fertile vines have both bigger clusters as well as being better pollination because they're self-fertile and so they get pollinated relatively easily. The first ones that were released as wine types. They had berry size, maybe 5 to 7 grams. And so having a lot of 5 to 7 gram berries didn't stress out the vine too much because the berry size was relatively small. We then used self-fertile flowers to breed the first fresh fruit cultivars that were self-fertile. Those tended to be things like Coward and Triumph, things like that. Your berry size in there was maybe 9 to 10 grams. Those vines are starting to be a little bit stressed from high fruit load, but still they could handle it. But as we got up to things like Ruby Crisp and Palk, we increased the berry size to 15 grams. We kept the self-fertile flowers, and it's just getting to be too much crop load on the vines. When you're starting to see the berries all on the vine and they're not covered by the leaves, that's showing you have too much crop load. This is delays your harvest because it can't pump enough sugar into the berries to ripen them as quick as it should. Your berry quality goes down. Your harvest is delayed because it takes longer to get the sugar into the berries. And it sets you up oftentimes for some freeze damage in the fall because your vines are just stressed out. And if you get one that is real weak, it'll come back the next year. It doesn't have enough reserves in the roots. These shoots will be even shorter. It'll set the same amount of crop load. And honestly, some of these vines can basically just fruit themselves to death. And so what we want to do in a breeding program, we want the big berries because that's what what the market demands. We want the self-fertile flowers because we want consistent cropping year to year. But we want it all. We also want the vines to do well. And so what we want to do is get more vigor into the vines to handle that extra crop load that we're getting from the self-fertile flowers. So the next question was, where can we get the diversity we need to increase the genetic variability in our program to get that vigor that we want? And so the way we decided to go about was Muscadine's a very interesting crop because it's only been bred since really the early 1900s, the first decade in 1900s. And all of it was documented well. And so we know what vines were selected from the wild, what the first crosses were. We have very good information compared to ancient crops like Vitis vinifera, where that was all done in Roman times and before. And so there weren't good notes. So it's an interesting crop in that way. We can go back to the full pedigree of most of our releases. And so that's what we did, is we put in, our input was our pedigrees of the 99 Muscadine cultivars, which is pretty much everything that's ever been released. And anything where we did not know what the parentage of it was were considered founders. So the founders are the first things used in your breeding program. And they can consist of several things. Known wild selections. So if you went out in the wild, you collected a vine because it had a little bit bigger berry and better flavor, that would be considered a founder. It can be unknown male parents from open pollination. So early breeding, oftentimes they just took the seed from a favored vine and planted those out and see if any of them were better. And so you know what the mother is, but you don't know what the pollen parent was. And so in that case, the pollen parent would be a founder. And then occasionally we had founders where it was just unknown pedigrees where we don't have records of it. So here's an example of Higgins, and I used Higgins because it's a little bit shorter pedigree. And so the founders of Higgins would be these here in red, where you can't trace it back any further. And so you can see Scuppernong appears several times. And then OP stands for open pollination. And so when they made the selection white male number 1, they know the seed came from Scuppernong, but they didn't know what the pollen was from. So that OP5 would be considered a founder. And so the reason you want to know this for all your cultivars is because you have different founders in a cross, then you're likely to get more genetic variability. So what is the genetic contribution of any cultivar of its founders? You're probably hoping there'd be no math. This is the formula that you use, and I'll take you through it. But you're basically looking for the number of generations between a cultivar and the founding clone to get what the genetic contribution is. So if you were looking at Higgins and you wanted to know, okay, you see Scuppernong is the founder in several places in its pedigree. How much of the variation in Higgins, how much of the genetics is coming from Scuppernong? So you just trace it along each time it appears. And so Higgins, half of its genetics comes from Yuga, half of that comes from San Manta, half of that from San Jacinto, and then half of that from Scuppernong. So it's half, a quarter, an eighth, a 16th. So a 16th of Higgins is coming from Scuppernong from this position in its pedigree. And then you do the next one, half, quarter, an eighth is coming from Scuppernong in this position. And on this one, a half and a quarter is coming from Scuppernong in this position. So if you add those up, you get 43.75% of the genetic contribution of Higgins is coming from Scuppernong. So we did that. We took 54 modern Muscadine cultivars released since 1970. That makes a nice cutoff, 1970, because 1970 is when the Fry cultivar was released. I think Noble was released in there. And basically anything that you're probably growing in your vineyards was released since 1970. Unless you have something really old, you don't have anything from before then. So we kind of considered everything released since 1970 as what our modern Muscadine germplasm is. And we looked at those, we did the founders for all of them, and we only found 33 founders in total for those 54 modern cultivars. But interestingly, most of those founders only appeared in 1 or 2 pedigrees, and we found only 15 founders in the pedigree of more than 2 cultivars. And so if you think about it, of all those cultivars, there's really not many founders that were used in the breeding program. We just haven't used that much genetic material. And if you look it up, these are your 15 founders there, and you took what the average genetic contribution. So if you pick, of those 54 cultivars, any random cultivar, about a quarter of its genetic variation is coming just from Scuppernong. Scuppernong was a bronze wild selection, was very popular for wine in the 1800s. It's fairly large, and they liked the bronze color, and so it was used in breeding quite a bit. And then OP5 was a very important one. OP5 is coming because they took Scuppernong in the UGA breeding program in the early 1900s. They got a male parent from Scuppernong open pollinated seed. That male parent produced bigger berries when you crossed it with almost anything. And so they used it at the University of Georgia quite a bit to produce the big berries we have in things like Fry and Supreme. You will see a lot of that in it, in their pedigrees. And then the other founders just produced about 10.4% of the variation. What this is telling us from a practical aspect in the breeding program is we don't have a ton of variation to go back and find genetic variability from. And so we'd like to bring in some from other sources. Then we took the founders and we saw, well, okay, where are they coming from? We have these founders, these 8 founders are known wild selections. The USDA in the early 1900s went out, talked to the people that produced those cultivars and found out, okay, where did you find them from? And they actually tracked down what counties, and they're generally coming from North Carolina, a little bit from South Carolina. And then these other founders, we don't really know where they're from because they're open pollinations. And they may not even be unique germplasm. If you took something and you take an open pollination of it, that pollination could be from the wild, in which case it would be unique genetics, or that pollination could be coming from the grower's vineyard and it's just another male seedling of Scuppernong, in which case it would not be unique genetics. And so these might actually be accounting for even more of the variation than we think through the pedigree analysis. So this is the range of Muscadine, and then the crosshatch here down here is the range of Muscadine as well as Vita Smithsoniana. So if you look at where the founders are from, there's a spot here where Scuppernong and Latham are from in eastern North Carolina, and then there's another spot here, northern South Carolina and southern North Carolina. This is where Muscadines were first pretty much domesticated, started making vineyards. The people were into Muscadines. They go out in the wild and find the best types to plant in their vineyards. It's not that this is necessarily better germplasm, it's just where the growers were. And then there's a little bit, Eden came from near Atlanta, and then there's a couple that came from Florida because USDA had some work that they were doing down in Florida. But if you look at all the native range, we're really not sampling very well that native range. And so we wanted, in the breeding program, to get some genotypes from outside of that range and see what other, maybe there's traits that are here that weren't here, and we're missing those completely in the breeding, or maybe just at least give us a better chance of getting more variability if we sample from out the range. So these are some of the things that we've worked and integrated into the breeding program. Some of the really interesting ones, I had a guy from Kentucky that was starting his own personal breeding program, and he and I were talking, and he was talking about, well, he'd found native muscadines in the Interlake region and along the highway in Kentucky and Tennessee, and that's pretty much the far northern range you could expect to have muscadines. And so he collected those and rooted some cuttings and sent those to me. I had a guy contact me. He was kayaking in the estuaries in New Jersey, generally considered much outside the range of muscadine, but he had a vine he thought was a muscadine. He sent me a photo and wanted to know, was it a muscadine? Could he eat it? I could identify it as a muscadine, so I told him he could eat it, but send me the seeds when he was done, and which he did. And so we have those. So we'll see if we get potentially some cold hardiness from these selections to use. I was very interested in getting some stuff from the western muscadine range because that really hadn't been sampled at all in early breeding efforts. So I've had some cooperators in Arkansas, in around Houston, Texas, send me some native muscadines from those regions, which we are growing out now and we'll be crossing. And then our last field day, we got some from southern Alabama. I've collected one from near my house, which is bronze, which is unusual in the wild. Not related at all when we did the DNA analysis to scuppernong. So that was interesting to see that bronze mutation there as well. And then one from Jekyll Island, where you get to the dunes of Jekyll Island, and surprisingly, muscadines can grow in those sand dunes in Jekyll Island, which that's some really poor soil, so it's interesting to see that. And then we're also interested in using Vitis popenoii. The USDA had a selection which we obtained. And that's a very interesting vine on popenoii. We crossed it with muscadine, fully fertile. Popenoii, when you grow it in the vineyard, it's from the tropics, so it doesn't understand winter. And it just basically comes out as early as it can in the spring, grows through the spring, through the fall. It's constantly flowering, setting fruit, setting new leaves, and it'll go up until December when it gets frosted down. Now, you would think, you would get freeze damage, behaving that way, but we have yet to see freeze damage on popenoii, so I don't know why it grows like that and is able to resist the freeze damage. But because of that growth, and when we crossed it to muscadine, we got extreme vigor in the progenies. This vine here, we rooted this selection the year before, and we planted it in March. So we had a little rooted vine that we planted. This is in August of that year, so it's growing up to the wire, went down and filled both sides of the wire, set out side shoots, bloomed, and set some fruit, all in the first year from planting that cutting. So we're getting extreme vigor from this cross. Now, this is what the fruit look like. They're about noble size. They are somewhat unpleasant to taste. So we got some work to do with fruit quality, but if we can, I think in 2 to 3, probably take 2 rounds to get to wine quality and maybe 3 to 4 to get to fresh fruit quality. And so it's just going to be a question, can we keep this level of vigor and yet cross it to the domesticated ones and get that fruit quality up to where we want it? But that's what we're trying to do. The other ones, we're working on crossing, see what kind of traits we get. Our general idea is to cross them to a domesticated muscadine and grow out that first generation, because it's hard to look at a wild muscadine. They're all kind of small with tough skin and black and moderately good flavor. I think when we cross one generation in, we may be able to see if there's some traits that we're interested in. Now, remember I said that you can't cross the muscadine and the bunch grapes and get fertility, and that's almost but not quite true. Some early work was done in the early 1900s, crossing the two, and they found if you looked and you worked hard enough and you did enough crosses, and you could get some that would show partial fertility back and forth. And so that's what Jeff Bloodworth in developing seedless muscadines has done some of that. We just this last year got a grant funded. The name of the grant's Through the Grapevine, Developing Vitis by Muscadinia Wide Hybrids for Enhanced Disease Resistance and Quality. And so that was led by Margaret Worthington and Renee Threlfall at Arkansas. And then there's a lot of institutions that are partial members of that grant, including UGA. And our whole point of this grant is to better understand why sometimes you can get that fertility and how we can figure out how to do it replicably instead of just making a bunch of crosses and hoping that something works. And hopefully, what we hope to generate from this is understand why it can sometimes work and then develop some hybrids which can be used as bridges, so that instead of the bunch grape people doing their stuff and the muscadine people doing their stuff, we can have some crosstalk between the breeding programs. Bunch grapes are very interested in muscadine because of our disease resistance. There's not many fruit crops that grow in southern U.S. where it is hot and rainy all the time. And so Muscadine's kind of unique that way. They've already used it in the past for bringing in downy and powdery mildew into bunch grapes. They'd also like to look at bringing in black rot resistance. And there's a new virus, grapevine leaf roll associated virus, which is something that they're very worried about for the wine grapes. And we potentially have muscadine resistance to that virus. They also want to bring in southern adaptation and maybe novel flavors into the bunch grapes. Bunch grapes, we've already got some seedlessness, but we'd like to be better at bringing in and getting seedless in our crosses, as well as berry texture and perhaps the big bunches that you see in Vitis vinifera would also be a trait that might be of interest to muscadine. And so that's where we're going with that grant. And I would also say that having worked with one or two of these hybrids, that is generally a pretty good source of getting some vigor into your crosses. I don't know if you know, if you've grown Southern Home, that's one of the only muscadine that has bunch grape in its background. It's got that cut leaf phenotype. We've used that as a parent a couple times, and those progenies tend to have pretty good vigor. And so if we could get even more bunch grape genes, I think we could also increase vigor that way. All right, that's it for my talk. If you had any questions, I'd be glad to take them. Yeah, Gary.
So I know that Higgins was one of the muscadine highly susceptible to Pierce disease. They say muscadine aren't, but Higgins, as you well know, Pierce disease is taken. So is it stopped as far and never used again as a breeding cross?
No, Higgins isn't everything because it was a parent of Fry.
Okay.
So if it may have just been that selection, but yeah, most things you're growing have Higgins in its pedigree.
And wasn't Fry aerated with nuclear, I mean, wasn't it some adaptation, aerated, whatever, with, you know that issue about Fry?
No, I don't, I'm not, was it?
With a radioactive isotope or something?
I don't think to make Fry, no. That was not used in it. The reason Dr. Fry said that Fry was large is because it was coming from that white male through Higgins, and he said that was the source of the large berry size in Fry. Anything else?
Just a quick question. Suprema Terra has been your primary parents in most of your woods.
Yes.
And both of those characteristics of those two varieties is low vigor. So the low vigor in those varieties is back traced to the inbreeding.
Probably. You can, and it's one of those things that oftentimes it seems like in your breeding progenies, the good traits segregate with the bad. And so we pushed fruit quality in those over maybe vine vigor, and I think that's probably why we're having the trouble that we're having now. And so we try to be more cognizant now of what the vine vigor is before we make those selections, and especially before we're putting them into trial. It's something that it wasn't clear, because when you look, and the other problem is when you're growing these selections, oftentimes that lower vigor doesn't really come into play until they start setting the full crops. And so when you're growing them year 2, year 3, you got relatively low crop, they're young, healthy vines, you're maybe not seeing the problem early enough, and that's when you're making the decision to put it into the more advanced testing. And so it's just something that we've had to learn the hard way a little bit to pay a little more attention to what the vigor is.
But does it make sense with what the earlier speakers spoke about putting the palm at 10 or 15 instead of 20? Because you're having a root base that's supporting less trellis. And they indicated as the trellis got longer out, it got more depleted and less.
Yeah, and that's something too that was also a problem with our breeding program. And so we take the seedlings, and they're at 2 feet, and we're just seeing, okay, do they have good fruit? Are we interested in them? and we select them, we root the cuttings, and then we put them into a selection block. And that selection block, because we have limited trellis space, and we want to grow as many things as we can, and we don't want to grow just one vine in case one vine dies and then you'd lose it, we're growing 2 vines in 20 feet, so they're 10 feet apart in that selection block. And so I think that is also why we weren't maybe seeing the vigor problems, because they were at that 10-foot spacing, and that was kind of solving the problem. And then when we went to the yield trial and put them at 20 feet, then they didn't look as good. And so, yeah, I think for these very large berry size, self-fertile types, I think most of them probably would grow better at 15 feet. If they're really vigorous, maybe 18, but I mean, 18 is not much different than 20. I would probably take it down to 15 feet. The downside is you can't plant them right at the post, and that makes it not quite as easy to set up your vineyard that way. But either you need to reduce that spacing, I think, or we need to start looking at some kind of crop load control or something, because it's just, 15 gram berry when they're setting all they can set, that's just a lot of crop on those vines.
But then a lot of those variables are overcome by just practices. Honestly, you can prune, cordon, more severely. That's what we have to do with one that is delicious. We grow delicious. That's our main variety we put in plant sales, delicious.
But I would say 2 things about Delicious. Delicious is a vigorous vine, and it's got less inbreeding because I think it's got Southland in it, which is very unique.
I mean, we go in there and prune, space, the fruit spur way apart. I mean, we get
Yeah.
you think you just strip it out, it ain't gonna make nothing. And then next year, it may 10,000, 12,000, 15,000 pounds.
Yeah, it's not that you can't grow, you want to, as a breeder, produce something that most people can grow versus, because not everybody's going to be able to do everything for the vines. But yeah, you can help those vines by giving them the care they need.
I got one more question.
Sure.
All right, so if you take Lane, Hall, and Rufus, okay? All 4 of those varieties would have the same lineage.
No. Hall is Fry by Terra,
Okay.
but they're all inbred.
Okay. Then, in my experience, Ruby Chris and Paul grow better than Lane and Hall.
I would agree.
Okay, so if, going back to the percentages, and I guess I'm asking, why do those 2 grow better than the other 2?
Well, every time you make that cross, the genetics get mixed up. And so when you look at the inbreeding coefficient, that's an average. There's some that are going to get better. There's some that are going to get better alleles than others. And so it's just, if you pick out, in any cross you can find, there's a normal curve of those. The average is here, and that's kind of what we're looking at. But if you pick from the outside edge of that curve where it's more vigorous, you can kind of overcome the pedigrees. Yes?
Is there any new wine planting pipeline that's released?
No, we do not do really much wine breeding at all. Georgia has always been traditionally mostly fresh market. We don't have a wine person at University of Georgia, so we just haven't really gotten into making crosses for wine much. Now, North Carolina has just released a new Muscadine wine cultivar, which you should be seeing in the nurseries in the next few years. And so you might want to look at that. Or not, did I say North Carolina? I meant Arkansas. All right, everybody, have a safe drive back.